Hey y'all, it's me Tiffany and welcome back to my channel. So this is a continuation of, I guess maybe like just experiencing books from a decade. I've done 1900, 1910, 1920, and now we're in the 1930s. This one's a little differently in my last other ones. I try to make sure I've never read any of the books before, and I didn't really care if they related in genre, country, whatever, because I wasn't comparing and contrasting. I was just reading 4 books from whatever decade, right? One of these books I have read before, so that's how this one's a little different. And also, I did a 31 and 31 day book challenge, and in the 2 of the 3 parts, I do mention all 4 books that are in these videos. So if you did watch those, you know what's coming up. And I mentioned them very briefly, but I will go into more depth here. But this is not going to be a full-on analysis. This is just my opinions, my views, whatever, right? I'm just enjoying books, or hopefully enjoying the books that I read. So for the 1930s, I basically list these just, as I go. And the first one I want to talk about is As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner. This is an interesting book. I have never read anything by William Faulkner before. This is a thing. Things happen. But everything that's happened, I'm kind of unaware or unsure what's going on because there is a lot to go on. There are 15 narrators. It's like this book should almost be called a series of unfortunate events because that's definitely what happens. There's a lot of sadness, but there's a lot of comedy. And there's a lot of foolery. There's just a lot. It doesn't seem like there would be because this is not a very long book. But there is a lot. And there are 15 narrators. So maybe I should not have read this in such a quick time that I did. But I definitely do not regret this book. So this is about a family in Mississippi way back when. And their mama dies. And she wants to get buried in her family's plot instead of just being like at home or in her husband's plot. And her husband wants to do the right thing, even though he is normally like considered lazy and all these things. He wants to do right by his dead wife, and the family goes along with him. And even though they're trying to do the right thing, a lot of stuff goes wrong, and it takes them 9 days to get to the city they need to get to because they're like in wagons and stuff. So it naturally takes longer, but a lot of stuff goes wrong, as I mentioned. So there's some days they just delayed themselves. There was the bridge accident that wiped out their horses. There was family members arguing. Somebody broke their leg. It was a lot, and it delayed them 9 days. So naturally, the body starts to smell. So they're having to deal with the grief of their mother. And even though she's in a coffin, they can smell her.
Yeah.
Mississippi is hot. If you've never been in the deep south, it's all humid. So the body's definitely going to decay faster. It's going to be miserable. It's going to be sticky. There's mosquitoes. I'm from Alabama, but I've been in Mississippi, and I know Mississippi has a little bit more swamp, so that's like a thing too. And this is not an experience that I would ever want to go through. And there's so much humor and tragedy in this. Like, you almost don't want to laugh because they're going through so much crap, but you kind of have to laugh a little bit because it's so ridiculous. It is so ridiculous. This does require a lot of effort, but if you don't mind effort, this is definitely, you will not forget this book. I know there's a movie, but yeah, I watched it after this, and I'm not sure if I really liked the movie because of the way it was filmed. It was like split screen most of the time. It was kind of odd, but I know he was trying to do with the 15 narrators. Like, it wasn't bad, but it was just like, the movie's a lot of effort to watch too. But there's also really strong old farm southern dialect, which can be hard if you're not experienced or you've never experienced even modern farm, country, southern dialect. I moved out of the South, and I don't even have a dialect or an accent as strong as what was portrayed in this. Because I was born 60 years later, and I'm from more of a city urban part of the South, but sometimes people have a hard time just understanding me. And if you've never dealt with that type of dialect, that's even more southern, more farm-like, which means it's going to be the grammar, and then it's old. It might take you a minute, but if you've experienced stuff like that before, then you're just going to do fine. The narrators is what kind of got me a little bit. And it was so dramatic, but it wasn't like dramatic. It was written in a way that's like, ooh, dramatic, but somehow it's still kind of funny. So this is a lot of effort. The movie's a little effort, but I promise you it'd be worth it. Just read it slower than what I did, and maybe you'll be a little less confused, but this was definitely a thing, and my mother is a fish. So for some reason, everything I picked for the 1930s had to be a harder read. And I decided to read them all during my challenge, which made it even harder. But this one is probably going to be the hardest. And I mentioned in the first part of the challenge video that maybe I'm just not intelligent enough to read this and get it fully. But it was short. It's an LGBTQIA plus classic. And, there's lesbians and stuff in this. And it is interesting. It is unique too. It is called Nightwood. This is short. This is the shortest one I think I read of the bunch. And I don't know if I call this a novel, but it's not poetry. It sways. It's surreal. It's like vibrant. It's confusing. And I had to kind of like read this twice to really even get what was going on. And I think it was meant to be like that, or maybe I'm just not, maybe I don't have the skills to read this and appreciate this fully, because sometimes stuff can just be complicated to read, right? And they are meant to be complicated to read, and sometimes you need skills. Like, there's nothing wrong with the book. That's just how it's supposed to be, and sometimes you have to build the skills up, right? Like, even with Shakespeare, if you have not been exposed to Shakespeare and you haven't been taught how to read Shakespeare, it's going to be a challenge. And whatever genre or whatever way you would call this writing style, I've never been exposed to anything like this, and I don't know if I have this skill set. But it was definitely an interesting read. I do not regret reading it. Would I reread it again? I'm not sure. It's like a woman marries a dude, has a kid, leaves the man for a woman, eventually leaves like the woman for another woman. Everybody's friends with this gender fluid doctor. The doctor has a lot of monologues, and like, this is about a woman who basically leaves everybody for kind of like somebody else's motives, is from what I got. It's not like difficult in like As I Lay Dying or The Trial. Like, The Trial, you're meant to be confused the entire time you read it, because you're supposed to know as much as the narrator, right? And As I Lay Dying has a lot of point of views, but this was just, there's like prose, there's like poetry, like the way she writes is very like, I wouldn't say flowery, but it's definitely like stylized. And it was just really confusing for me. I really think the strength in this book is the prose and the artisticness of this more than the story, to be honest. But I definitely haven't like read too many books where a woman just constantly leaves everything all the time for, I guess I want to say like earlier, it's other people's motives, but maybe it's her own motives, or it's a combination. Like, she really just doesn't know what she wants, and she doesn't want the lifestyle she keeps getting. And that itself is interesting. Okay, so the next book that I'm about to mention is probably my favorite read out of the bunch, and that is Johnny Got His Gun. This is an anti-war book based in World War I. Our main dude has lost his limbs. He can't speak. He can't see. There's a lot going on, but his mind is functional, and he starts going in through like insanity because like Naturally, I think your mind would spiral if you couldn't move, you couldn't talk, you don't know what's going on. You can't even see the people taking care of you. And like, I believe he can hear, but that's like it. And I think that would drive most people insane, especially like the way that vets are treated and the trauma of just being in war itself, especially World War One. Man, this was a good book. This was a good book. This is a scary book. But if you don't mind body gore and like flashbacks and stuff about wars and yeah, because he was in an explosion in like a little dugout thing, and that's how he got into this mess. Apparently, this book was inspired by a Black Canadian soldier who lost his limbs and stuff in a similar fashion. Curley Christian. I'm gonna link down like links of this, like the original man's story, like below. This is fictionalized and this is not meant to be him, but it was the idea inspired came from a news article that the author saw of this soldier, and so I think his story should be heard too if you're gonna read this. So I'm definitely gonna link something about that Canadian soldier below. And man, so the way this is written, he has like hallucinations of the past. He has like the way it's written, I wouldn't say it's grotesque, but it's like pungent, maybe it might be the way I would describe this. And it's interesting because I haven't read many books. I mean, I've read books that have talked about Morse code, but not actually use Morse code. And like a way that he knows how to communicate is eventually he gets his wishes known by the nurse by doing Morse code with his head on a pillow. And in the book, it's kind of cool too. Like, let me find the page. But you can actually like, here we go. You can see like Morse code written in the book, and it's formatted in there. And I think that's like a very interesting way to get things across, especially if you have no limbs and you can't talk. Like, how are they, communicating would be so difficult. The writing is haunting. He yells, he screams, he's dealing with PTSD. He wants his life back. He feels like he's just like trapped in his body, and like, I couldn't imagine like reading this. It felt so scary, like just being trapped and you can't do anything, especially when you've had the ability to just get up and walk, or just to communicate, or just to do this, or just to do that. He just wants to go back home to LA and be with like, people he loved and his job. And he's just trapped there in a hospital. He can't even know what time it is or what day it is. And so, yeah, I mentioned he like figures out with the Morse code, but it's just like the trap in all his thoughts. And I said, like, I think that would be realistic in that situation. But that doesn't mean it's not scary. So this is the next book, and the last book I'm going to talk about is the one I reread. I read this originally in my 11th grade year in high school. I had a research paper on it. And it's a John Steinbeck book called The Grapes of Wrath. And I've read like 5 John Steinbeck books, and I've been going through this thing where I've been wanting to reread like the books I read that were required in high school, just to see how I feel as an adult. I don't think I'll ever do this with my college reads because that would take a while, but I haven't been in a super fast-paced hurry of this challenge. Like, I've been doing this challenge probably since like 2018, around the time like I graduated. But this is one I reread, and I know in the past videos I said like I was planning on just doing new books, but my video, my challenge, I decided to make an exception for this because I've been putting it off for a while because I've read 5 John Steinbeck books, and they've all been school related, and I have not liked a single one. Besides this, I have read The East of Eden, Of Mice and Men, The Pearl, and Tortilla Flat. And I did appreciate Of Mice and Men a lot more the second time it came around. I don't think John Steinbeck is my author, and that's okay. But along like with Of Mice and Men, I did appreciate The Grapes of Wrath more the second time I read this, because I guess maybe that I'm older and I have more experience reading things. I just get it. And it's not me like just trying to do good on a test or a paper. I do think school sometimes messes books up for that reasoning if it's not a book that you would like naturally jive with anyways. And I think maybe I was too young to read this. So this takes place in a very bleak part of American history. It's an extremely slow-paced, long book. There's a lot of descriptions in this. This is during the Dust Bowl, Great Depression, and this is like when farmers are forced to move and to migrate out west. And I really didn't get the whole social justice that was in this when I first read it, and I did pick up on that this time. And maybe because it's the second time I read it, I picked up the nuances in the very beginning of the book and how bleak and slow and depressing this would be throughout the book, you know. And there's things that are like high, like, you know, like kind of like foreshadowing. You don't really see that a lot of times if you know the first time you read a book, especially if you were like younger and a teenager, at least in my experience. And the book does have a little humor in the beginning, but it gets more and more depressing the further you go into the book. And the humor's a little dark. I think the strength of Steinbeck, just from my experience with 5 of the books, and especially with this one, is I think the strength relies on symbolism to get help through the plot a lot. I think that's just the way he writes. Like, the symbolism is definitely strong in these books, and not just like something a teacher tells you to watch out for. Like, for example, in chapter 3, there's a turtle. He almost gets hit by a woman. They move him off the road, but the turtle's determined to get across the road, and then like eventually gets hit and flipped. And I think that is symbolism for basically how hard these families are trying to move across the country, because they're moving from Oklahoma to California. That is a long, long drive, you know, even now. And back then, you know, with like lesser cars, that would be a hard journey, especially like out in the desert, you know? One thing I don't like about Steinbeck, especially in this book, is the scenes, even within its own chapter, they feel like there was no transition. It's just kind of like boom, boom, boom. And you kind of need a transition or flow or something to make sense. And I don't think, in my personal opinion, that this was like executed very well. But I think the story has a meaning, you know, like that should be known about. And if you want to read something of what was probably super realistic of this time, this would be it. But I don't vibe with Steinbeck. I kind of wish, like I said, the scenes transition more. The way he writes, and especially in this, is very slow, and it took all of my effort for me just to like not mind drift the entire time I read this. It wasn't compelling. It wasn't gripping for me. Okay, guys, that is it. So if you read any of these books before, let me know. I will be working on 1940 books, and maybe I'll pick some easier reads this time. And hopefully I get some great gems. And I will see you later.